The neighborhood had always seemed perfect on the surface. Trimmed lawns, freshly painted fences, and quiet evenings where only the distant hum of passing cars broke the silence. But behind the postcard image was a homeowners association known for its suffocating control. They prided themselves on enforcing every rule to the letter, no matter how small, and no matter who got hurt along the way. The trouble began on an otherwise ordinary morning. A plain white envelope appeared in the mailbox. No stamp, no return address, just a bold HOA letterhead. Inside was a curt notice stating that the property was out of compliance with community standards. The claim was almost laughable. The paint on the mailbox post had supposedly faded beyond acceptable color tolerances. It was the kind of accusation so absurd that it almost felt like a prank. But the HOA didn't send jokes. The letter carried a warning: repaint within 10 days or face a fine. 10 days later, another letter followed. This one included a $200 penalty for failure to address violations. Confusion turned to anger. The mailbox post had been painted less than a year ago, and its color matched every other post on the street. Something didn't add up. Soon, more letters arrived. Each one carried new accusations: the grass allegedly too long, the trash bin supposedly visible from the street for more than 2 hours, even a claim that holiday lights had been strung up past the deadline for removal. It was harassment disguised as enforcement. Neighbors whispered about similar letters they had received, but most complied quickly, afraid of what would happen if they resisted. That fear only emboldened the HOA board. As the stack of notices grew thicker, so did the determination to push back. The homeowner wasn't about to be bullied on their own property. Carefully, every piece of correspondence was filed away. Photos of the yard, mailbox, and house were taken daily as evidence. Every fine was documented, every absurd claim noted with timestamps. This wasn't going to be handled with a paintbrush or by trimming the grass a quarter inch shorter. This was going to be handled differently. It didn't take long to figure out why the HOA was suddenly so aggressive. At the last community meeting, whispers about redevelopment opportunities had circulated. Rumors that certain board members wanted to force out homeowners who didn't toe the line. The board president, a smug man with a taste for power, was at the center of it all. He had pushed through new amendments, tightening control over property appearance and granting the board sweeping authority to levy fines. Those who complied were left alone. Those who pushed back became targets. When yet another letter arrived, this time threatening legal action and even eviction if non-compliance continued, the gloves came off. Eviction from a fully paid-for home wasn't just an overreach. It was illegal, and if the board wanted a fight, they were about to get one. The next step was quiet preparation. Property records were reviewed. HOA bylaws were examined line by line. State statutes governing homeowners associations were downloaded and studied late into the night. What became clear was that the board was acting far beyond its legal authority. They had skipped required hearings, failed to give proper notice, and were issuing fines that exceeded the amounts permitted under state law. This wasn't just petty harassment, it was a pattern of abuse. And patterns can be proven. But fighting in HOA isn't easy. They thrive on intimidation, and they count on homeowners being too busy or too scared to push back. Most people just pay the fines and hope the harassment stops. This case would be different. This homeowner wasn't going to back down, and they weren't going to fight alone. A quiet call to a local attorney specializing in HOA disputes set the stage for what was coming next. By the time the board sent its final notice, a formal demand to vacate the premises for continued breach of community standards, the trap was already being laid. What the HOA didn't know was that every letter, every overreach, and every unlawful threat was building a case against them. A case strong enough to not only stop their campaign of harassment but to take down the board entirely. The battle lines were drawn, but this wasn't going to be fought on freshly mowed lawns or behind closed doors at a community meeting. This fight was heading to court, and once the legal system got involved, the HOA would learn just how costly their abuse of power could be. The stage was set. The homeowner had evidence, an attorney, and the law on their side. The HOA thought they could bully one resident into submission. They were about to regret underestimating the wrong person. The HOA expected the usual pattern. A frightened homeowner scrambling to comply, repainting, trimming, and paying whatever fines appeared. What they got instead was silence, followed by something far more dangerous. The attorney who had been quietly retained wasted no time drafting a letter to the board, a formal notice of intent to challenge every single violation they had issued. The letter wasn't emotional. It was surgical. It listed, in excruciating detail, every unlawful step the board had taken. It cited state statutes, HOA bylaws, and legal precedents that left no room for interpretation. The board had not held mandatory hearings. They had levied fines exceeding the legal cap. They had issued threats of eviction that they had no authority to enforce. Each point was backed with documented proof. Photographs, timestamps, and the HOA's own letters turned against them. When the board received the notice, panic set in. The president tried to call an emergency meeting, but several members were already nervous. They had joined the HOA board to keep the neighborhood nice, not to get dragged into a lawsuit. The letter made it clear. If they didn't back off, they would be held personally liable for damages. For the first time, cracks appeared in their united front. But the president wasn't about to back down. He believed that sheer intimidation could still work. He ordered the HOA's management company to continue sending fines and threats, doubling down on the pressure. The next letter arrived with an even steeper penalty, claiming the property was now accruing daily charges for non-compliance. They assumed the homeowner would break under the financial weight. Instead, those letters were collected like trophies. Behind the scenes, the attorney prepared the opening salvo, a lawsuit for harassment, defamation, and unlawful enforcement of HOA regulations. The filing didn't just seek to cancel the bogus fines. It sought damages, attorney's fees, and a full accounting of the HOA's financial records. If there were any irregularities in how dues were being spent, and rumors suggested there were, they would come to light in court. News of the lawsuit spread quickly through the neighborhood. What had once been whispered conversations over backyard fences turned into open discussions at community events. Other homeowners quietly shared their own stories of being targeted by the HOA. Some had paid thousands in unjust fines just to make the harassment stop. Now someone was fighting back, and it gave them hope. The board's arrogance had finally met its match. Still, the president tried to rally his allies, painting the lawsuit as an attack on the entire community rather than on their misconduct. But residents had grown tired of his heavy-handed tactics. Attendance at board meetings swelled as neighbors demanded answers about why their dues were being wasted on legal battles. The pressure inside the boardroom was building, and the president could feel his control slipping. The first court date was scheduled, and both sides began gathering their forces. For the homeowner, the strategy was simple. Prove every single claim false and expose the HOA's abuse of power. For the HOA, the strategy was desperation. Bury the case in paperwork, delay hearings, and hope the homeowner would run out of money or patience. But they underestimated how prepared their opponent really was. Every piece of correspondence from the HOA had been preserved. Every photograph of the property was cataloged. Witness statements from neighbors who had seen the harassment firsthand were ready to be presented. The attorney had built a rock-solid case, one that showed not only how the board had overstepped, but how they had done so intentionally. As the hearing date drew closer, the president tried one last move. He sent a personal letter offering to settle the matter quietly if the homeowner dropped the lawsuit. It was an offer laced with veiled threats, warning that things could get messy if the fight continued. But that letter was handed straight to the attorney, who added it to the growing pile of evidence. Proof that the board was trying to intimidate a resident into giving up their legal rights. The homeowner stayed calm, outwardly unshaken, but inside the tension mounted. Court battles are exhausting even when you're in the right. The board counted on that, wearing people down until they gave up. What they didn't realize was that every underhanded tactic only made the case stronger. By the time the day of the first hearing arrived, the board members were nervous, but the president still strutted into the courtroom with an air of confidence. He believed the HOA was untouchable. After all, most residents didn't fully understand their rights, and many assumed the HOA had near absolute power. He had no idea just how wrong he was. The homeowner and their attorney walked into that courtroom not just to defend a single property, but to challenge an entire pattern of abuse. The stakes were higher than anyone realized, and the fallout would soon reach far beyond one mailbox, one lawn, or even one board president. The opening statements were about to begin. The HOA thought they could intimidate their way out of accountability. They were about to discover how badly they had miscalculated. The day of the hearing arrived under a gray sky that seemed to mirror the tension inside the courtroom. The homeowner sat beside their attorney, calm but alert, while the HOA president strutted in wearing a self-satisfied grin. Behind him trailed two board members, their nervous glances betraying cracks in the facade. They weren't as confident as their leader, and they had reason to worry. The judge entered promptly, and the room fell silent. This was no casual community meeting where the president could bark orders and silence dissenters. Here, every word would be weighed, every document scrutinized. The HOA was about to face someone they couldn't bully. The proceedings opened with the homeowner's attorney laying out the case in meticulous detail. Every letter the HOA had sent was entered into evidence. Each accusation was countered with photographs showing the property in perfect compliance. Records were displayed proving the mailbox paint was fresh, the grass neatly trimmed, and the trash bins never left out beyond the allotted time. The attorney pointed out that the fines exceeded the legal maximum by nearly double, and that the threats of eviction had no basis in law whatsoever. The judge listened carefully, his expression hardening as the pattern of harassment became clear. Then came the witnesses, neighbors who testified to seeing HOA board members prowling around the property late at night, snapping photos and looking for any excuse to issue violations. Some even admitted they had received similar baseless fines and paid them out of fear. Their testimony painted a picture of an HOA that had turned from a governing body into a weapon for personal vendettas. When it was the HOA's turn to respond, the president tried to project confidence, insisting the rules were necessary to protect property values. But under questioning, his statements faltered. The judge pressed him on why proper hearings hadn't been held, why the fines were so high, and why the board issued threats it had no authority to enforce. Each answer grew weaker, and each document the HOA produced only strengthened the case against them. The most damaging moment came when the president was asked about the settlement letter he sent. The attorney read it aloud, word for word, showing how it attempted to coerce the homeowner into dropping the lawsuit. The president tried to claim it was a friendly offer, but the tone of the letter spoke for itself. The judge made note of it with a sharp glance that sent a chill through the board members seated behind him. By the end of the day, the balance had shifted. What the HOA had hoped would be an easy victory now looked like a looming disaster. The judge didn't issue a final ruling that day, but he did something far worse for the HOA. He ordered a full review of their financial records and governance practices. Any irregularities would be exposed under oath, and any misuse of HOA funds could carry legal consequences far beyond this single dispute. The board left the courtroom shaken. The president tried to keep up appearances, declaring that they would fight to the end. But his bravado rang hollow. The homeowners in attendance saw through it, and whispers began to spread like wildfire. If the HOA had been abusing its power, how many others had been wronged? How much money had been wasted on unjust fines and frivolous lawsuits? Back at home, the homeowner felt a surge of vindication, but also knew the fight wasn't over. HOAs rarely give up easily. They would stall, delay, and try to rally support. But now they were on the defensive. The evidence was overwhelming, and the court was watching closely. The homeowner's attorney was already preparing for the next hearing, digging deeper into the HOA's operations and subpoenaing records that the board would rather keep hidden. Late at night, as the homeowner reviewed the growing stack of documents, a new thought emerged. This battle had grown far bigger than just one property. It was no longer about a mailbox or a lawn. It was about exposing a corrupt system that thrived on intimidation and fear. The HOA had picked the wrong person to target, and the cost of their mistake was only beginning to surface. As the deadline approached for the HOA to turn over their financial records, panic spread through the boardroom. Some members began questioning the president's leadership, worried about what the audit might reveal. If dues had been misused for personal expenses, inflated contracts, or secret kickbacks, the lawsuit wouldn't just remove them from power. It could put them in serious legal jeopardy. The homeowner, however, remained steady. The evidence was airtight, the legal team relentless. What started as a petty campaign to force one resident out was turning into a full-scale reckoning for the entire HOA board. The president still clung to the belief that he could bluff his way through, but with every passing day, his grip on power weakened. The next court date loomed, and with it came the possibility of exposing every secret the HOA had tried to bury. What they thought would be a quick eviction was becoming their undoing. And when the records finally surfaced, the truth would shock the entire neighborhood. The subpoenaed financial records arrived in the attorney's office stacked high in brown boxes, the kind usually reserved for moving day. What the HOA thought would intimidate the homeowner only served to reveal just how much they were trying to hide. The attorney and their team went line by line, reviewing every receipt, every bank statement, every expense report. It didn't take long before the irregularities started to appear. The HOA's financial trail was a mess. Thousands of dollars labeled as landscaping improvements had no corresponding invoices. Checks had been written to companies that didn't seem to exist. Personal expenses were buried inside generic categories: restaurant bills, hotel stays, even luxury retail purchases, all charged to the association's account. The board president, it seemed, had been using HOA funds like his personal piggy bank. The homeowner's case, already strong, now became explosive. The lawsuit wasn't just about unlawful fines or harassment anymore. It was about fraud, embezzlement, and the betrayal of every family paying dues to keep the neighborhood running. The attorney compiled a damning report, organizing the evidence in a way even a casual observer could understand. As the next court hearing approached, whispers in the neighborhood turned into open conversations. Residents who once feared speaking up now began to share their own suspicions. Many had long wondered why HOA dues kept climbing despite no visible improvements. Now they had their answer. The board president's grip on power began to weaken as even his staunchest allies questioned whether they had been complicit in his schemes without realizing it. The courtroom was packed when the hearing began. The homeowner sat quietly while their attorney presented the findings. Page after page of records displayed unauthorized spending. Large sums of money, dues collected from hardworking families, had been siphoned off for personal gain. When the attorney explained that these findings would be turned over to law enforcement for criminal investigation, the room shifted from murmurs to stunned silence. The judge ordered an immediate audit of the HOA's finances and temporarily stripped the president of his authority to act on behalf of the board until the investigation concluded. The ruling sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. For the first time, the HOA was not just being challenged. It was being dismantled piece by piece. Inside the boardroom, chaos erupted. Several members resigned outright, unwilling to face further scrutiny. Others tried to distance themselves from the president, claiming they hadn't known about the misused funds. But the damage was done. The association's leadership, once feared and untouchable, now looked weak and disorganized. Despite the victory, the homeowner stayed cautious. People like the president rarely gave up without a fight. And true to form, he attempted one last desperate maneuver, secretly contacting other board members to rally them into blocking the release of additional records. But every message, every phone call, every attempt to obstruct justice was documented and handed to the attorney. His efforts only deepened the case against him. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself began to change. Residents started gathering informally to discuss what would happen once the board was removed. For years they had been living under strict, arbitrary rules designed to control rather than protect. Now they saw a chance to rebuild, to form a fairer association or even dissolve it entirely. The homeowner who started the fight became a quiet symbol of resistance, someone who refused to be intimidated when everyone else felt powerless. As the investigation expanded, law enforcement took interest. Financial crimes officers began interviewing neighbors and subpoenaing bank records directly. What began as an HOA dispute was evolving into a full-blown criminal case. The board president, once so smug, now faced the very real possibility of arrest and prosecution. On the eve of the next major hearing, the homeowner reflected on how far things had come. A simple letter about a supposedly faded mailbox post had exposed deep corruption and rallied an entire community. What was meant to scare one person into submission had instead united dozens in defiance. But there was still work to be done. The court hadn't yet issued its final ruling, and the president still had allies willing to fight for him, if only to save themselves. The homeowner prepared carefully, knowing that the next step would determine everything. This wasn't just about clearing their own name anymore. It was about making sure the HOA could never again abuse its power over the people it claimed to serve. As dawn broke on the day of the next hearing, the president walked into court looking pale and cornered. He had traded his arrogant grin for tight-lipped silence. Behind him, only one loyal board member remained, the others having fled the sinking ship. The judge was prepared to hear final arguments, review the audit findings, and decide whether to dissolve the board entirely. The room was tense. Everyone knew the end was near, but how devastating that end would be was still uncertain. The courtroom buzzed with tension as residents packed the benches, waiting to see how far the scandal would reach. The president of the HOA, once smug and commanding, sat rigid at the defense table, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Gone was the air of untouchable authority, the weight of weeks of investigation, and the threat of criminal charges pressed down on him like a vice. The audit findings were worse than anyone had imagined. Not only had association funds been misused, but the scale of the theft was staggering. Tens of thousands of dollars in dues had been siphoned off to cover luxury vacations, personal shopping sprees, and even payments to a shell company secretly controlled by the president himself. The fraudulent activity stretched back years, far beyond the petty harassment that sparked the lawsuit. The homeowner's attorney presented the findings with clinical precision, piece by piece. Bank statements showed transfers from HOA accounts to private ones. Invoices for community improvements led to businesses with no physical addresses. Even signatures on board approvals were forged. Every detail painted a picture of a man who had turned community leadership into a personal cash machine. The president's remaining ally tried to object, claiming ignorance, but the documents told a different story. At least 2 board members had signed off on questionable expenses without reviewing them. Whether they were complicit or simply negligent, the court would decide. For now, their silence only added to the air of guilt. Residents watched as their worst suspicions were confirmed. The rising dues, the lack of transparency, the constant threats, all had been tools of control, designed to keep people compliant while the president enriched himself. The judge listened carefully, his expression grave as he reviewed the evidence spread across the bench. The turning point came when law enforcement officers stepped forward to present their own findings. Subpoenaed bank records confirmed that HOA funds had been diverted to accounts linked to the president's personal name. It was no longer a matter of civil liability. This was a criminal case in the making. The judge's tone sharpened as he warned that continued obstruction or false testimony would only add to the charges. The president, cornered and visibly sweating, attempted to shift blame, claiming he was the victim of a misunderstanding. But each excuse crumbled under scrutiny. The paper trail was too clear, too detailed, too damning. Every forged signature, every missing receipt, every misused dollar was tied directly to him. By mid-afternoon, the courtroom atmosphere had changed completely. What started as an eviction dispute had become the unraveling of a corrupt regime. The judge issued a preliminary ruling removing the president and his remaining ally from the HOA board effective immediately. A temporary receiver was appointed to manage the association until a new board could be elected. The ruling also ordered full restitution of stolen funds, pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The man who once sent threatening letters and fines to intimidate neighbors was now stripped of power, forced to sit in silence as the judge detailed his wrongdoing. His arrogance had been replaced with fear, and the sight of it brought quiet satisfaction to every resident who had ever been bullied by his tactics. The homeowner felt a surge of relief but also knew this wasn't the end. Removing the president was only part of the battle. The criminal investigation was still underway, and restitution would take time. But the foundation of the HOA's corruption had been cracked wide open. Outside the courtroom, reporters began gathering. News of a suburban HOA president facing fraud charges was too sensational to ignore. Cameras rolled as residents spoke of years of harassment, unexplained fines, and intimidation tactics. What had once been whispered complaints now became public testimony. Inside, the homeowner's attorney filed motions to recover legal fees and additional damages for emotional distress caused by the unlawful threats of eviction. The case was evolving beyond defense into outright offense, not only clearing the homeowner's name, but holding the board accountable for every action they had taken. As evening fell, the former president left the courthouse flanked by his lawyer, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The crowd watched silently, no jeers, no shouting, just the heavy satisfaction of justice beginning to take shape. But there was still one more chapter to write. The criminal charges hadn't been finalized yet, and there were rumors that the president, desperate and humiliated, was planning a last-ditch attempt to shift blame or destroy evidence. The homeowner knew better than to celebrate too early. The battle for justice was almost over, but the final blow had yet to land. When it did, it wouldn't just end the president's career, it would change the entire neighborhood forever. The weeks following the court's removal of the HOA president were turbulent. Investigators combed through every document, every bank record, and every transaction the association had made under his watch. What began as an inquiry into harassment of one homeowner now spiraled into a full-scale criminal probe. Residents who had long remained silent finally stepped forward. They spoke to investigators about fines levied without cause, threats of foreclosure, and intimidation tactics used to silence dissent. Each story painted a clearer picture of a man who wielded power not to protect the neighborhood, but to control it for personal gain. The community that once cowered now stood united, sharing information, attending hearings, and demanding accountability. The evidence was overwhelming. The fraudulent invoices, the forged signatures, the unexplained transfers, it all led to the same conclusion. The former HOA president had stolen from his neighbors, using their dues to fund his lifestyle. Law enforcement moved swiftly. One morning, before dawn, unmarked cars rolled quietly into the neighborhood. Officers walked calmly to the president's front door with an arrest warrant. Moments later, the man who once issued eviction threats to others was led away in handcuffs, charged with embezzlement, fraud, and forgery. News crews descended on the quiet subdivision, broadcasting images of the disgraced leader being escorted into a squad car. Residents watched from their driveways, some in disbelief, others with grim satisfaction. The man who had tried to force a homeowner out of their fully paid property was now being forced out of his own, not by fines or intimidation, but by the weight of the law. Inside the courtroom, the case shifted from civil to criminal. Prosecutors presented the findings in painstaking detail, explaining how tens of thousands of dollars in HOA dues had been siphoned off over years. The forged signatures on board approvals became undeniable evidence of deliberate deception. The defense tried to claim clerical errors and accounting mistakes, but no one believed it. The paper trail was too neat, too consistent, too intentional. The judge handed down a scathing rebuke, ordering restitution to the association and sentencing the former president to prison time. The ruling also required the HOA to undergo full restructuring under independent supervision, ensuring that no future board could ever abuse its power in the same way. For the homeowner who started it all, the victory was both personal and profound. The bogus fines were wiped away, the threats of eviction formally declared unlawful, and legal fees reimbursed in full. More importantly, the community itself was freed from the toxic rule that had poisoned it for so long. Neighbors began holding open meetings, discussing how to rebuild trust and decide whether to even keep the association alive. Some wanted it dissolved entirely, preferring to govern themselves informally. Others believed a reformed HOA could still serve its intended purpose, protecting property values without abusing authority. Either way, the shadow that had hung over the neighborhood was gone. The homeowner watched the transformation unfold. Yards once patrolled by board members looking for rule violations now hosted barbecues and block parties. Conversations that used to be whispered in fear were now open and honest. A single act of resistance, refusing to bow to intimidation, had inspired others to speak up, and together they had taken down a bully hiding behind legal power. Months later, as the former president served his sentence and restitution payments trickled back into the association's accounts, the neighborhood began to heal. A new board, elected by a near-unanimous vote, promised transparency, fairness, and open communication. Financial records were posted publicly. Decisions were made collectively. The authoritarian regime that once ruled through fear was gone for good. For the homeowner, the fight had never been about revenge. It was about standing up for what was right, proving that no one, not even an HOA president, was above the law. What started with a single letter in the mailbox ended with a corrupt man in prison and an entire community freed from his control. As the sun set on a calm evening months later, the homeowner looked out over the street. Children played in driveways. Neighbors waved to each other. There were no inspectors lurking with cameras, no threats pinned to doors, no fear of arbitrary punishment. The victory was more than legal. It was a reminder that courage and persistence could dismantle even the most entrenched abuse of power. The HOA had tried to evict one homeowner. In the end, it was their own corrupt leader who was cast out, leaving behind a neighborhood stronger, wiser, and united in a way it had never been before.